A recent trove of FBI documents was unearthed that should cause everybody grave concern, especially as Donald Trump has assumed command. I would argue it should have caused concern before as well, but especially now that Trump is taking over. And our next guest has been involved with the handling and interpretation of these documents. Cora Currier is a journalist with the Intercept, and she specializes in national security issues. Cora, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely, and I've been looking at the documents that you guys have published on the Intercept, and to use slightly unprofessional language about it, I'm kind of freaked out. I really think it's a big deal. And could you give us a little background on this story and these documents?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we obtained were a number of the FBI's operating guidelines. So these are manuals that agents use when they're conducting investigations. They cover everything from extremely mundane, bureaucracy, which form to fill out for what kind of thing, to, much more kind of profound statements about how the FBI interprets its authorities and what it believes it's allowed to do in different places and in different situations. And so we obtained a number of documents, but three large main manuals. One is the FBI's sort of operating Bible, its rule book, that's called the Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide, or the DIOG in FBI lingo. And that has been released in part before, but with heavy redactions. And so we obtained an unredacted copy of it. And secondly, we obtained two sort of supplements to that main rule book, the DIOG. One is for counterterrorism agents. It's called the Counterterrorism Policy Guide. And the other one is about informants, and it's called the Confidential Human Source Policy Guide. And so those are sort of, they lay out the rules for agents in how to handle informants, how to handle counterterrorism cases, and in the DIOG's case, how to handle a whole range of techniques and investigations.
Well, and I want to, before we go into them in a little more depth, Cora, I want to remind our listeners that there is a very, very long history of FBI abuse of civil liberties. So these documents should be taken extremely seriously by everyone involved and by the public at large. Were there any major surprises before we get into the specific documents? Were there any major surprises as far as you were concerned in what you saw in there?
I think not huge surprises. What, they some of what they cover is what you expect them to do. And, in fact, the DIOG, the main rule book, is in many ways a reflection of that history, that past history that you referenced of looking into First Amendment protected activities, going after activists, using the FBI's surveillance and investigations as a political tool. We're talking about the Hoover's FBI. And more recently, under George W. Bush, we had investigations of anti-war groups. There was a lot of, so it's not all distant history. The worst abuses seem to be, but so some of the guidebook is very much reflecting that, and it'll say that we have they have to jump through extra hoops when something is sensitive, when involves a religious group or a political group, but those rules had been redacted, and what's under the redactions are various carve-outs for, ways in which they've maintained flexibility. It's not that they can't infiltrate religious groups. It's not that they can't infiltrate political groups. They need some supervisor's approval. And this, what I think was often what was surprising is what they felt, the secrecy, what they felt the need to keep redacted. And, we felt that it was essential that the American public be able to see these rules, because we've had so many cases, where there have been cases of informants in mosques, informants in student groups. And, we need to be able to point to the actual rules and point to their actual policies and say, hey, are you even following your own rules? And do we agree with the rules? Do we think that there's enough here, enough protection here?
Yeah, and I guess a global question. Obviously, they've kept these documents secret. Are there, and I'm sure their defenders would say, well, they need to keep them secret. Do you feel, in your opinion, are there legitimate reasons? And by the way, my opinion as a journalist's job is to report. But in your opinion, would there be any validity to an argument that says some of what they say in here should be kept secret, as opposed to being exposed to public debate?
Well, we read, every word that we published of the documents, and we made that calculation. We looked through. We met with the FBI. We had conversations with them about the documents. We gave them ample opportunity to say, hey, this is, if you reveal this, it will actually be, and it could put someone's life in danger, could put some operation in danger. And we did withhold certain things that were not in the public interest, that really were just about law enforcement, that really were, things that people could use against legitimate organizations, legitimate tactics. And so we did withhold things. We didn't just dump the documents online. We spent months looking through them, and the parts that we publish, the parts that we emphasize, that we've written about, are either things that are, should be extremely uncontroversial to have in the public, that have been public in other places. The redactions are very inconsistent. Mm-hmm. Or they are things that we think there's a genuine public interest in knowing. For example, I wrote about online investigations and how the FBI is, what rules they have for operating online. And that is something that they have, not been forthcoming with at all, have not been transparent about.
And again, we're talking with Cora Currier of the Intercept. So let's talk about online investigations for a second, because online security is becoming a bigger topic of discussion, certainly in the circles I go in. What did we learn about their rules regarding online investigation?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that we learned is that there are, agents and undercovers, informants, have quite a lot of rope when it comes to just sort of hanging out on forums, on websites, on, online, in order to build up a persona. So, they want to make themselves a convincing character on a convincing undercover. They can chat with people who have nothing to do with the investigation whatsoever. It's not just they go online, they looking for the person that they're investigating, or going to an ISIS chat room or something and start chatting with people who are clearly under investigation. They can chat with anyone. They can create a persona. They can have unlimited conversations with someone. And I don't think people realize that they had that much leeway to sort of, interact with people while undercover. And similarly, it describes, that there's been major problems with deconfliction, like actually running into other agencies, other FBI operations, foreign agencies even, just really shows that there's a massive law enforcement presence online. And, that in one way, that's not surprising, right? If we're talking about radical forums, if we're talking about, groups that are clearly, Facebook groups that are clearly aligned with, terrorist groups or something like that. But I think there's, what we don't know is the gray areas, when they're looking at people's Facebook pages, when they're monitoring, political discussion groups and stuff, and the FBI would say, well, we have to have a reason for being there. We have to be looking at some particular individual, or we have to be looking at the group because they're properly, concerning and not just a political group. But, I think there's still a lot of questions about, how they make those decisions and how much flexibility they have in deciding that they can look into a group.
Did it address the issue of flexibility at all? Because I always, wonder, even in a confidential document, how much is put in there as a kind of CYA tactic to say, well, of course you need to get permission, and of course it needs to be a group with which we have legitimate concerns. So did you get a sense of how much, do they convey a sense of how much latitude these agents may have to investigate a group on their own, to go into a forum on their own, to basically act independently?
Well, the FBI, the rule books, and the FBI spokespeople that we spoke with, very much would emphasize that everything's being reviewed by a supervisor. That even if a an agent doesn't go get permission before opening an investigation or checking into something, that they're going to shortly thereafter have to have a supervisor looking at it and have to justify it. But I think one thing that that all looks good on paper, but there's a lot of variability between field offices. There's a lot of I think there's still a lot of room for people to justify why they think that they should be looking into something. And we have recent examples of that. There was a field office was dinged not that long ago for having improperly looked into pipeline protesters, for people who were protesting the Keystone pipeline. And eventually it was found that they'd done so improperly, that the group was a legitimate political group and not looking to, do any damage to the pipeline, but just protesting it as they had a right to.
So, and in a case like that, for example, a supervisor might be in agreement with the inappropriate feelings of his or her staff on that, right? So that's not necessarily a protection. As I recall, there were also stories about differences of agreement within the FBI about how aggressively to pursue reopening the Clinton email issue, and whether they did so for valid reasons or because they were too closely allied with Rudy Giuliani. I mean, you hear all sorts of stories, and you're much closer. You report on this issue. I don't, but it seems to me that the issue of latitude and acting without, for example, a court's direction is something that, as a basic principle, it seems to me we should be concerned about. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I think that the current political climate really points to, how we are at, in some ways, how politics can change the way that laws are interpreted. We have these laws, we have these rule books, but, also these rules are based on Attorney General guidelines. They were last, the set that this is operating under came from the last years of George Bush's administration. They've been updated and revised somewhat under Obama, but they're still, the FBI doesn't have a statute governing it. It's run at the, under the Attorney General's discretion and the rules that he makes, and those are subject to change. And I do think that the way that they're implemented, again, at the office level, at the, in the different departments, can be hugely variable. And we saw that in one of the documents that we obtained. We have this the official confidential human source manual, which is vetted by the top lawyers at the FBI. But then we also got a field office document from FBI Anchorage, which was talking about, basically sort of in very blunt terms, how they manipulate informants, how they use information that they get against them, the sort of psychological games that they play with informants. And, the FBI headquarters wouldn't comment to us on that document. But I think it shows that, you can have these global rules, but what really matters is how they get implemented.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I guess I would wrap up by asking you, Cora Currier, whether there were two or three specific issues beyond this broad issue of FBI discretion to investigate, which can be abused, in my opinion. But were there two or three other issues you thought should really be subject to public debate and discussion that came out of these documents?
Yeah, we had we did a number of stories from this. Some things are really they seem like small things, but to see them in print is sort of a big deal, right? So my colleagues, Jenna McLaughlin, one of my colleagues, dug into a part of the guide that talks about stingrays, the use of these boxes for surveilling, picking up, collecting cell phone information. And in the guide, the FBI says that they shouldn't rely on evidence from stingrays, that they should get backup evidence, that they should, not just that it should be used for lead purposes only. And this has been a hugely controversial thing, the use of stingrays and how reliable they are, whether different police departments are using them. They've been very secretive about them. So to have it here in a just bluntly stated in a document that the FBI does not think that they're, on their own good evidence and also kind of hinting at this practice of parallel construction, where you get some evidence one way and then go get it another way that stands up in court better. So something like that is very important that Jenna highlighted. Trevor Aronson, who I worked with, looked at the informant policies, and one thing that he noted was how bluntly also it talks about the use of immigration and how clearly there's a whole section of the guide on immigration, and this is something that we have huge amounts of anecdotal evidence of people talking about being pressured to become informants, and the FBI sort of threatening their immigration status with that. But to have a whole, of course, they don't use the word threaten, they don't use the word pressure, but there's an entire chapter of this guide dedicated to immigration. And I think that will be, really useful to point to and to analyze when you get cases of very vulnerable people being pressured to work with the FBI.
And each of those topics could be a segment of their own on this program, and maybe they should be. Maybe we should follow up on it because I think it's terribly important, each and every one of them. And the documents themselves are very worth studying. So the website is theintercept.com. The series is the FBI's Secret Files, and our guest is Cora Currier. Cora, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.